Hello and welcome to Bobby Tells Tales. Well, yes, I'm only an NFT. However, I'm very good at telling stories. So, to my right, you're going to see the words, and to my left, you're going to see the words. But I'm going to tell you some very interesting stories. Yes, so let's get on with the first story. And the first story is called The Boy on the Train. How exciting! So sit down and listen to my story. Here we go. So let's begin where all stories begin, at the beginning. As you might expect, this little bundle of trouble by the name of Willy was taking much longer than the rest of his family to find his feet in his new home in Australia. And it wasn't long before young Willy was up to his old tricks, though, and getting himself into trouble and causing his long-suffering parents embarrassment and problems again. Willy had a long history of causing more trouble than he was actually worth. And one of the reasons that his family had decided to take the long trip to Australia and find a new life was to get Willy away from what his parents thought were bad influences. However, things didn't turn out to be exactly what they had planned, and Willy was soon up to his old tricks. Willy soon began to find his way around, and at every opportunity, his inquisitive nature found a way to exercise that mini explorer inside him that had for the last year been capped by his parents for fear of the unknown in this his new home. Willy had realized that one of the more interesting aspects of his new and exciting landscape was the two rail lines running through Buderim Mountain. Buderim Mountain lay on the northeast coast of Queensland. It wasn't exactly on the coast, but it was about 100 kilometers inland. It was a rural farming community that grew and processed ginger. I like ginger. Gingerbread, ginger beer. The first thing that grabbed Willy's interest was a narrow gauge steam train line that ran along the centre of the road and through the high street of this little farming community of Buderim. Now, twice a day and every day, a small Thomas the Tank Engine looking train, very similar to Thomas the Tank Engine, pulling about 50 trucks of unrefined sugarcane in large bundles, would pass through the centre of town on its way from the local cane fields surrounding the town to the refinery that was situated just on the outskirts of the town of Buderim, close enough that the sweet smell of the sugar refining factory enticed every small child within miles to see and smell it. From our homestead on a string bean farm on the hill overlooking Buderim in the valley, you could hear the whistle of the sugar train and the smell of the sweet air wafting up Buderim Mountain. And at times it was irresistible for a small adventurous boy like Willy. He just had to go and investigate. One day after school, what was to be a national headline story started to unfold. And as usual, Willy was at the centre of all the trouble. Climbing onto the sugar-loaded carriages and breaking off stalks of raw cane to chew and eat was a popular pastime for a lot of the kids in the area. If you felt peckish, a little hungry after school, it was simply a matter of grabbing a stalk and sitting on the top of a bundle until you had enough to eat, or grabbing a handful of peanuts off the ground. It was easy. If you snapped a stalk of sugar cane where it was still green and still fresh, it would break easily with a snapping sound at the ring around the growth ring around the stalk of sugar. That little train carried all manner of rural goods in and out of the area, everything that Budrum Mountain might need on a daily basis, mainly, though, refined sugar and peanuts. Willy soon regularly found himself climbing in and out of those carriages laden with literally tons of fresh peanuts and sugar cane, helping himself to handfuls of delicious fresh nuts, all grown locally and shipped out to packing plants elsewhere around Australia. The main thing for Willy was that the train yard made an irresistible playground for all kids who liked adventure, and of course it had an endless supply of food. Peanuts, peanuts everywhere, all over the floor. And for a young lad like Willy, a ground covered with peanuts spilling out from overloaded trucks was a feast, available whenever he felt like a snack, especially after school. It was a normal summer evening that day in Budrum, a Thursday night if I remember. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was warm and bright, with that sweet, sugary smell lingering in the air from the afternoon shift at the refinery. Willy had decided to wander down to the stockyard, as he often did after school, and as he wandered into the rail yard and across the slippery tracks, he noticed that usually there was only one row of loaded trucks and a large old-fashioned steam engine that looked unattached further down the line. I don't think it was attached, if I remember. As usual, and on his own, and met by a deserted yard, after all the workmen had gone home for the night, he decided to investigate. He wandered across half a dozen deserted lines towards two loaded carriages, picking up handfuls of peanuts on the dusty, dry ground as he walked. And amongst the gravel and weeds, he would just pick them up off the ground. With the dirt, he didn't care. As he crawled under those carriages, under the axles, with complete disregard for his safety, he didn't really care. It didn't occur to him that it might have been dangerous, until he came to a point under the carriages that seemed too risky to go any further because of the increased amount of grease on the ground, the axles and wheels, and not wanting to risk getting his school clothes dirty because of reasons already stated. His mother would kill him. The sleepers were still sticky from the tar and the oil that soaked into the wood, and the hot sun earlier in the day had melted. Thinking it's now safer to climb from under the carriages without being seen, and find a way to climb onto the top and confront his imaginary enemy. So with a piece of sugar cane as a sword and a black oily patch on his right eye, where he'd rubbed the dust whilst cleaning his eyes, just looked like one of those black patches that a pirate would wear. So he rubbed his eye with his now blackened fingers And as he searched like an SAS soldier for a route up onto the top of the carriages, it wasn't long before he found a route up onto the platform between the two carriages, and grabbing hold of some loose boards on the side of the track, it was easy to pull his small, stocky, fat frame up onto the top of the tarpaulin, which covered the carriages. Not so easy to get back down, though, once the enemy was under his control. The truck was full and overflowing with unshelled peanuts, and it would have been easy to have sunk right into the middle like quicksand. So he had to be careful whilst walking across the top. Even though those trucks were covered in a tarpaulin, it was still very sponge-like, like quicksand. And the last thing he wanted was to sink into a melting pot of peanuts. But this blatant and clear danger hadn't really occurred to Willy. As usual, and anyway, he had the enemy to seek out to destroy. The danger was not a factor. Walking on the tarpaulin-covered peanuts felt like walking on the moon. It felt like walking on a soft blanket. No bounce at all, but it felt soft and comfortable. Comfortable enough to warrant a rest before attacking those once he had found out their location. So he sat down with as much weight as he could muster to make a comfortable dent in the canvas with his bottom, and to mould himself to the peanuts. Where are those pesky blighters? He said to himself out loud. Aye, aye, me shipmates, where are ye be? He said a little louder, obviously thinking they might just pop their heads up on his command, which they didn't. Then, with a wiggle and a little more pressure under his bottom, he was able to make the shape of a nice bed, push his head back and lie there staring up to the early evening blue sky, just daydreaming. It was so comfortable. Thinking back to the now distant memory of his grandfather and his rabbits in the back garden, back in Baggy Bottom, a small country town on the outskirts of Stoke-on-Trent in England, and other familiar memories that had been haunting him for the last year. He'd missed home, but not enough to want to go back. Trying to force his familiar, loving memory back to the back of his mind so that he could just relax. It wasn't long before Willy's eyes began to get heavy in the late afternoon sun, and as his eyelids grew heavier, sleepiness began to take over his body until he was soon asleep. He soon sank into a deep sleep under that late afternoon sun, with his pale face beginning to go pink. A long day at school, and the excitement of being a pirate, and a belly full of peanuts. It all had become too much, and without regard to the sun and his tender English skin, Willy was now oblivious to the impending danger he'd put himself into. And we're not talking about the sunburn here. Remember, he's asleep on the top of a train. It was around 6:30 when his eyes had finally given up the ghost, and unbeknownst to him, this shipment of peanuts was about to head off down the tracks towards Brisbane, 100 kilometers south, to the refineries and to be made into peanut butter. By the way, one of Willy's favourite sandwiches, which wasn't going to help him at this point. He was already being missed at home, and his mother was beginning to become worried, if not angered, by Willy's lateness. He had had strict instructions to be home by 6. It's now getting on for 7. Although Willy had often disregarded his mother's instructions, he had found himself grounded on a number of occasions recently for being late. So it looked as though more trouble was brewing yet again for young Willy. Not 10 minutes after he had fallen asleep, the train driver and the yard foreman had arrived to check the peanut shipment over before that night's shipment was to leave the yard and head down to Brisbane. Hitching up the old steam engine at the front, and signed the shipment document off for an early evening 2-hour journey down to Brizzy. But unbeknownst to them, Willy is asleep on the top, and unbeknownst to Willy, they're about to leave. Nothing unusual for these two guys. All in a day's work for these rough and ready-looking yardmen, with necks like old leather. The loud voices of the man laughing and joking, and the driver walking up the track checking the linkages between the carriages didn't stir Willy. He was long gone. He was fast asleep, and nothing short of a sharp shunt as the truck started to move would wake him. The excitement and the warm evening sun had sent him off into a deep sleep, snuggled into the body-shaped indent of the tarpaulin-covered peanuts, and deep enough into sleep that the voices walking up and down the track didn't stir him. Those two men had done their final checks. And then finally, with a whistle from the engine, they started to take up the slack on the carriages, and one by one, a little shunt, as each carriage connected under the tension of the engine pulling. The engine slowly took up the slack between the laden carriages, and the whole line of trucks slowly gathered momentum. Slowly at first, but with the whistle of the engine, they started to move. The engine was far enough away as not to stir Willy from his deep sleep under the sun. As the signal light up in the distance changed from red to green, and the yard foreman lifted his arm with a red triangular flag, he started to wave goodbye to the engine, and the whole line of trailers began to move. It was already too late and too noisy to prevent Willy from calling out. Instead, the train started to slowly move out of the yard and start its journey down to Brisbane with a little extra package, still half asleep on top of one of the carriages. He'd woken, but hadn't quite realised yet what was going on. It took about 5 or 6 seconds before the carriage Willy was lying on snapped into action and shunted forward. You see, with a sharp tug and sudden clang of steel as the connecting chain gear linking the carriages to the rest of the line began to move. Willy opened his eyes at this point. It was at least 10 more seconds before the small, sleepy boy realised that something wasn't quite right. He lay there looking up at the sun for what only seemed like a moment to gather his thoughts. Then, with a sudden burst of adrenaline surging through his blood and rubbing his eyes, even blacker than with his oily hands, Willy sat up, only to see the wires above his head moving and a violent vibration as the peanuts began to settle lower and lower. As he began to sink under the weight, the vibration of the moving train, and his small, heavy frame, he realized with horror that he had to get off this moving train, or at least shout for help, or something, and quick. He tried to stand up, but the vibrations were making him sink deeper and deeper into the peanuts. Now, even though he was standing, this short little fat boy was struggling to look over the sides of the truck. He was sinking lower and lower into the quicksand of peanut shells, not knowing what to do. And that's the end of part 1. Well, thank you for listening. And if you found it even half interesting, have a look for part 2 on our channel, which will be arriving very soon. And also, if you'd like to hear more, if you'd like to read more, please have a look at the book. It's great. It's got 3 stories in the book, and it's available on Amazon. You can buy it in digital form, in paperback, or in hardcover. Yes, even hardcover. So, I'll see you next time in part 2, okay? Bye. Just before I go, just one last reminder, if you wouldn't mind. It would help me a great deal, because I don't have the use of my arms. Please click the subscribe button. Thank you. I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you are ready to start learning English with the professionals, why not continue and buy this course? Remember, this short course is one of many we have made for you. So, check out our other courses. If this course is too difficult for you, then buy our first course. If it's too easy, then move forward and buy the next number up from this one.